Dr. Sutherland writes something that I genuinely had to read a few times because it was so crazy. He said, quote, "Physically, the Negro was at his highest state of development as a slave." That is on page 2. He's like, listen, we got to talk about Black people. And here's my citations. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero, and this is NYTN, where we talk about American identity and family stories. I am all about the primary sources. I want to start by telling you exactly what this document is and where you can find it, because that's actually where primary source work begins. We want to look at the object itself. Now, I've gotten in so much trouble on YouTube for some of this primary source work that I've had videos demonetized, flagged, all that stuff. One in particular was a document that said the word colored. It was my great uncle's birth certificate, and he was listed as colored. I was discussing that, and I guess that's a slur. I mean, he's alive, and that's his birth certificate. But as a historian, as a trained historian, primary sources are my happy place because I like to put history into context. We need the context of what people believed at that time. We're not saying that a primary source means, hey, this is the gospel truth, right? But it was somebody's truth. And that's what we want to look at. This speech is titled "The Destiny of the American Negro," Memphis, Tennessee, November 1905. The Tri-State Medical Association is holding its annual conference, and a physician from Rosedale, Mississippi, H.L. Sutherland, has just finished speaking. He was the president of the association that year, which means this wasn't just a random presentation from some guy who got a slot to speak. He quotes from a verse from the book of Romans. Paul was crying out, "Who shall deliver us from this body of death?" But H.L. Sutherland attributed this to Black Americans. He said they were the body. Deliverance was their removal from the U.S. The room applauded. The speech was written up and published the following month in the Memphis Medical Monthly. I'll leave links to this in the show notes. It entered the official record. Now, my family was living in Louisiana as people of color when this speech was happening. These were the people he had already written off. Now, I have the document in front of me right now, and I want to go through it with you because the way Sutherland builds this argument, I think, is something important to talk about. On the top of the first page, it says reprinted from the Memphis Medical Monthly, December 1905. Below that, H.L. Sutherland, M.D., Rosedale, Mississippi. I will show you how to get to this later. So let's be clear, though, first about what we're holding, what we're looking at. This is not a private letter someone found in a box. This is the keynote address of a regional medical association delivered by its sitting president, H.L. Sutherland, published in a peer-reviewed medical journal. This has a bibliography. There are 9 sources listed. There are other doctors, other publications. Dr. Sutherland is working within a network of ideas that already existed at the time, and he's citing them the way you would cite sources in an academic paper. He's like, listen, we got to talk about Black people, and here's my citations. So you can find this document and other documents like this through the Library of Congress's digital collections. You can use Google Scholar. You can go through medical history archives. I love Library of Congress. That is my favorite. Other places have digitized early American medical journals. But the reason I'm telling you that is because I want you to do what I did. Go find this thing for yourself. Do not take my word for what it says. Pull it up, read it, because reading it yourself is going to be a completely different experience than hearing me describe it. So his opening claim, I want to read exactly as he wrote it. He says, quote, "After 40 years of freedom," he's referring to Black Americans, "after 40 years of freedom with the paternalism of our government to uphold and sustain him against the dominancy of the superior race, his emancipators must confess to a measure of disappointment in his progress. For the millions which have been spent on his education by state and by charitable individuals, there has been a fair return in a lessened degree of illiteracy." I'm going to pause right there. He's only about 40 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. It's kind of crazy to think about that, right? He's talking in 1905, and it's been about 40 years. And what he's saying is that the government has been like a dad to Black Americans, this is his opinion, to uphold and sustain them against the superior race, to kind of protect them a little bit. I can tell you what he means by the superior race. He means white people. And he's saying his emancipators, though, are disappointed. They haven't made enough progress. We've spent a lot of money on them in the past 40 years. We've been so charitable to them. And they're illiterate. And it's going to get a little bit crazy. But paradoxical as it may seem, his moral and physical conditions have notably deteriorated. That's the first page. That is his thesis. Okay. What he is saying is Black Americans are worse off now than they were under slavery. So he's positioning himself as someone who wanted the experiment of freedom to work, and he is sorrowfully reporting that it hasn't. I think his perspective is doing a lot here because it's going to make everything else sound like he's doing an honest account rather than advocating for a conclusion here that he started with. What I mean by that is I don't think that he really feels like that, but he has to frame it like, oh, it's just so bad that this didn't work. And here's the rest of the bad news. Then Dr. Sutherland writes something that I genuinely had to read a few times because it was so crazy. He said, quote, physically, the Negro was at his highest state of development as a slave. That is on page 2. Pausing here, if you don't know my family story, I descend from many dozens of enslaved ancestors. I have been really proud of many of them who worked to emancipate themselves, manumit their children, buy property as people of color during a really difficult time in the South. And I can assure you that statement is not accurate for my family. I can assure you of that my family is better off after being emancipated, right? But he argues that enslavement, and he's talking about the food, the field labor, and the, quote, good sanitary condition of his quarters, his words, produced health. And that freedom for Black Americans produced disease. That is the foundation of his medical argument, that liberty is a pathogen. When I am in a document like this, and we're going to get into this document, the first questions we should ask aren't about what the document says. We need to ask, who's it for? Who produced it? What gave them the authority to produce it? Who's the audience? Because these answers are going to shape everything else that follows. And obviously, we went over this. The answers here, we have a credentialed physician. He's talking in an official venue. He's speaking to peers who are already inclined to agree with him about his crazy views on Black people, which we're going to get to. This was not a document that was designed to persuade a skeptic. It was designed, in my opinion, to give a sympathetic audience a framework and a vocabulary for these ideas. So that's the first thing that this document is going to tell us. And just to kind of connect it to the genealogy side, my family, like I said, were people of color living in Louisiana at this time. And which means I can put his predictions next to the records of my family and see what happened. He's going to make some predictions, and that's where we're headed. Okay, so he's going to talk about tuberculosis, and this is where I really want you to pay attention because I think this is the clearest example of this gap between his evidence and his conclusions. So now he's like, okay, they were healthier when they were slaves. And then he goes on to say, quote, tuberculosis is a house disease. It's practically settled that it's a disease of environment only. So he's sending another physician here. This is an idea that some other people had, that tuberculosis is a disease of the environment. So if you have bad housing, overcrowding, malnutrition, that's how you get tuberculosis. And then he goes on to say that, quote, the radical treatment of the trouble would be the separation of the races. Whoa. Whoa. So we read these sentences back to back. Tuberculosis is a disease of environment, and the radical treatment to deal with this tuberculosis outbreak is separating races. Now, these conclusions cannot come from the same argument. If you accept this idea that tuberculosis is caused by environmental conditions, the solution would be to change environmental conditions, right? Separating people by how much melanin they have in their skin fixes nothing about housing or nutrition or overcrowding. It's addressing a completely different idea. If you've seen my videos on YouTube over the past 3 years, you know I don't believe in the idea of black and white. It's so nonsensical to me at this point. And case in point, me. People argue over, I'm black and I'm embarrassed. I'm white and I'm embarrassed. I'm not white enough, not black enough, blah, blah, blah. Like, what does it mean? How black is black? How white is white? He's using this here, and he's addressing his recommendation in medical language. Remember, H.L. Sutherland is a doctor. That is its function in this document. So then he makes a prediction about extinction. Okay. And I want to be clear that Sutherland didn't come up with this idea himself. He is citing another person named Frederick Hoffman, who had published a book called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro in 1896. So that's about 9 years before he talks. It's in Sutherland's bibliography. You can look that up. And he writes, quote, "The prophecy of the extinction of the Negro race by Hoffman, made 9 years ago, seems more probable of fulfillment now than then." So he's like, when this was written 9 years ago, it even seems more likely that they're just going to disappear. So now we have a doctor in 1905 endorsing an actuary's prediction from 1896, presenting it as scientific consensus in a medical journal talking to a bunch of doctors. That's how ideas like this traveled. I saw someone call it a citation network. I love that. It gives this appearance of accumulated evidence. Well, really, it's just the same claim. We're just repeating it by different people. It's kind of what happened on social media. You just have people kind of just saying it enough times that people believe you. Okay. But then on page 6, remember, I want you to find this document for yourself. Sutherland writes, quote, "We know there is scarcely a place in the South today where a respectable white man can be convicted of murder or even sentenced to prison for a short term for killing a Negro under any circumstances. This is one of our unwritten laws inspired by our contact with the Negro." So this doctor is telling us about this unwritten law, and he says Black people are being killed and the legal system won't prosecute. And he attributes this, the quote, brutalizing effect, he says, of it, his words, to Black people's presence, that the violence committed against them becomes evidence of their corrupting influence on white society. Folks, I gotta pause this. Again, I like to talk about American identity, family stories. You may be saying, what are we doing with this? Well, I'm also a historian. We need historical context to understand our family. Okay, so if you have Melungeon ancestors, if you have Redbone ancestors, if you have any ancestors at all that could have possibly not counted quite enough at this time, he's talking about your family. This is just such a deliberate inversion, and it's a published record in a medical journal. He's like, they're so corrupt that when we're violent against them, we don't even get in trouble because they're just such a corrupting influence. Okay, so I'm trying to stay analytical, but I also know that my great-grandma was alive in Louisiana as a little girl when this was published. And Sutherland is recommending in his policy section, a man with a lot of power, that, quote, "the entire race, both for its own benefit and the benefit of the white race, should be colonized and kept under government supervision." That is his medical recommendation. Government supervised colonization of an entire population. Remember, this is 40 years after emancipation. Now he's going to bring in the Bible, right? So near the end of the speech, Sutherland pivots. And I think this is the worst part of the whole document. Worst part. And I'm going to say this. I'm a Christian. You may not be. We can both agree that he is twisting something here. He writes, "It is a stupendous task to undertake to save a race of people from extinction whose characteristics are ignorance, immorality, and superstition, and which regards our efforts as inimical to its welfare." He's like, Black people don't even care. But we owe it to posterity. We owe it to our children, he's saying. We owe it to ourselves as a Christian obligation for, quote, "he has been laid at our gate." Okay, this phrase, "he has been laid at our gate," is a direct reference to a parable of the Good Samaritan. You may not know this story. It's the image of someone that's been beaten and left on the road by robbers and is in need of help. So in Luke chapter 10, Jesus tells the story. He's answering a lawyer who asks, "Who's my neighbor?" Jesus is teaching, and the guy raises his hand, a real smart aleck. Like, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus jumps into storytelling. And he says, "A man's left for dead. A priest walks past this man. A holy Levite man walks past. And then a Samaritan, someone who was actually mixed. A Samaritan was someone that the religious establishment at the time wouldn't have associated with because they weren't full Jew, stops and helps this man. And Jesus asks the lawyer, which one was the good neighbor? And the lawyer has to say the one who shows mercy. So that's the story that Sutherland is invoking. I have to, again, say, one of my biggest problems as I've been studying this history is the idea that, like, no one was laid at your gate. You may not like the way that the groups have been interacting up at this point in 1905. But you guys brought slaves over. You fought to keep slaves. You built an economy on the backs of slaves. It's really upsetting to me to hear this idea that someone's been laid at your gate, so to speak. Like, well, someone was laid on their doorstep to take care of. And now we're looking at racial separation as an act of Christian duty to do the best thing for everybody. But the entire content of that parable Jesus talks about is mercy. Mercy. And I don't see any of that in Sutherland's argument. I think he has just taken the form of that story and just twisted it into something else. And so his closing in this document, he said, quote, "If slavery was a sin, 40 years of freed men is an all-sufficient atonement. No doubt the transition period in a change of labor from the Negro to white would be a trying one and would bring financial disaster to many, but for the incalculable good it would bring to our sons and their sons to be forever separated from this inferior and corrupt race, the loss would be repaid to us in a re-civilization, and then in truth we would have our new South. And for this we should ever pray, quote, 'Who shall deliver us from this body of death?'" That is the last line of this man's speech. Romans 7:24. Paul wrote that. In the middle of his letter to Romans, he was crying out to God in that line. He felt like he was trapped between who he wanted to be and who he was. It's a really beautiful scripture. Paul's asking to be rescued from his own moral failures. He's saying, I want to do the right thing, but I can't. I feel trapped. Sutherland is using that to point at Black America, calling them to death. Paul meant it like, God save me from myself. Sutherland's using it to say, remove them from us. I don't think I need to tell you that's a distortion of scripture, but I'm going to tell you that's a distortion of scripture. He's done the statistics, he's telling you citations, he's telling you policy recommendations, and now he's asking God to bless his conclusion. That's how it ends, and everybody clapped. Right, everybody clapped. Well, what happened next? The speech gets typed up, gets published the next month in the Memphis Medical Monthly, and now it's in the official record of the American medical literature. That's how I found it, Library of Congress. Where was your family at this time? In Louisiana, my family was living their lives with no idea that the president of a regional medical association just called for a new South, formally called for their removal in print. That's what the records show. Where was your family in 1905? I think what's really nuts about this is he's saying, listen, we need to address slavery, and we gave them 40 years of freedom. That seems reasonable. That seems like a good deal for them. We have paid back what we took. That's what he says. And what can we even say here? What led to the Great Migration, right? People moving north and west and getting out of the South and things like that. Stuff like this. Stuff like this. I mean, there's a reason your family moved. For Dr. Sutherland, he was looking at the documented effects of poverty, of overcrowding, exclusion from medical care, legal impunity for violence against Black people. I mean, he says that. And he was calling these effects biological differences based on color. Based on color. I would like to sit down and ask him what group he'd put me in. And that's why things had to be so black and white. That's why the one-drop rule existed, because you couldn't have this confusion of who's white or Black. If you are holding ideas like this, you've got to know who's Black, right? Doesn't work. Doesn't work if you've got somebody bridging the gap. Doesn't work if you have huge swaths of the population bridging the gap. And this is what primary source work lets us do. When we're in the actual document and you can say, okay, page 4, page 6, let's look how these relate to each other. You can see, in this instance, Sutherland trying to create a cause and effect that just isn't there. But Sutherland was not unusual, unfortunately. That's, I think, one of the most important things here. He was a representative of a particular moment in American thought, medical thought, political thought, when scientific language was being used to give ideological conclusions. He's got his bibliography for this. Pull any of the names, you're going to see the same argument being made in different venues. Then they're citing different credentialed voices, and you just have this accumulated weight of consensus. That's how ideas like this got traction. So I think understanding that is more useful than simply saying, well, he's wrong. He's wrong. Let's talk about how he gained so much traction. I want you to check out this document for yourself. I will leave a link in the show notes, and I want you to look at it. Look at the bibliography, look at the crazy quotes. I want you to see it for yourself. This argument was wrong, still wrong. Not just because the data was fabricated, but because you see somebody kind of building backward from a conclusion that you're starting with. You can't start with your conclusion and then just be like, oh, and let's fill in the gaps. And finding this speech is important. This is not something you're going to see in your history books. This is the thing that I guess it's called critical race theory. Honestly, just going to the Library of Congress and typing some stuff and seeing what was talked about at the time. So if you want to find this document yourself, start with Google Scholar or Library of Congress online collection. Library of Congress is like my favorite place. I get so much stuff there. And just search Sutherland or Memphis Medical Monthly, and it's there. And I genuinely, again, encourage you to read it. Hearing me describe it is not the same as reading the words in the order he wrote them. That experience of engaging with a primary source is the whole point. He predicted my family would disappear, should disappear, and we didn't. Come find me on patreon.com/NYTN if you want to go deeper. Show notes are going to have sources and it's going to have sources and stuff to find, but I also have all my behind the scenes stuff. I have video up on Patreon, and I would love to see you there. I'm Danielle Romero, and this is NYTN. We'll talk soon.